Welcome to In the Gutter, a podcast that is all comics, all bangers, all the time, with story expert Lonnie Diane Rich and superhero scholar Joshua Unruh. One of the hosts has read almost no superhero comics, and the other has read almost all of them. We'll let you sort out which is which. And now, In the Gutter.
Coffee counts for water, by the way.
Coffee does, but I can't have the caffeine.
Oh, okay. I lost that argument recently when I was like, no, the caffeine negates it. Like, caffeine is a dehydrator, so it negates the water. And Lacey was like, you are incorrect about this. And I was like, I am rarely incorrect about these kinds of things. And she said, nevertheless, and upon some Googling, she was correct. I was wrong about this one. And I have no problem admitting that, especially because now I'm hydrating when I drink coffee. Like, there was no lose for me in this argument.
That's awesome. Exactly. Well, yeah, I was under the impression that the caffeine would dehydrate you a little too. I think it does a little bit, but like the net is hydration, with coffee. So. Yeah,
right. You net towards hydration. Unless you're drinking some kind of ridiculous, like, super caffeination coffee, which, like, gang, pump the brakes. Like, you can just get a couple hours more sleep at that point. Like, make good life choices.
Make good life choices. Who does that? Speaking of bad life choices, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the people in our comic this week. I'm trying to think I'm trying to make this segue work, and I'm like, well, Cap's not making bad life choices. Who's
I disagree.
Bad life choices?
In the flashback, there are some very questionable life choices that we can chat about. Once I give this little summary, let me jump right into that. In Captain America Winter Soldier number 5, a present-day conversation between Cap and Nick Fury uncovers the existence of Alexander Lukin and his involvement in the Red Skull's death, not to mention the disappearance of the Cosmic Cube and assorted other shenanigans. While musing on why Lukin is doing anything that he's doing, Captain America takes a trip down memory lane to Cronus, a village in the USSR that didn't survive a run-in with Hydra and the Red Skull during the Second World War. We're introduced to the Invaders and Master Man, but more to the point, we see how Lukin and his mentor first met. And at least, we may have an inkling of not just what Lukin is up to, but why his beef with Steve Rogers is so damn personal. We wrap up with Cap heading off to try and confirm some part of his memories, as well as exaggeratedly a sarcastic gasp, Nick Fury is keeping secrets, even from Captain America.
Wow, so awesome summary. I especially like your sarcastic gasping at the idea that Fury might be keeping a secret.
Well, who could foresee it? It's so out of left field. It's so out of character for the man.
Exactly. It absolutely is. All right. So this week we have another big exposition dump. As a matter of fact, I would say that most of this story is actually happening in the past.
Yes.
But the thing is that really, like, if you're talking about exposition, like, again, exposition is a necessary evil to storytelling, and trying to do it in the most elegant way possible is great. But sometimes a flashback can actually earn its space by being its own parallel story. And I think that's the situation that we have in this issue, is that we're bumping, from now to then. But in then, we're not just remembering stuff for the purpose of having the information.
Right.
We're actually living through a story for Cap. And learning about, in the process of experiencing that story, getting some of that exposition, getting some of that background, and understanding, Karpov, and getting a first sight of little Alexander Lukin.
That's right. I think also what's nice is, and there's no lampshade hung on this, but I think that some of the things we talked about being themes for this going forward wind up being part of the flashback. Like the fact that, let's just nicely say, compromises are made. Ideals are set aside in order to get the job done, which is an ongoing issue for Steve in the present. It's a question of where the line is, that we keep kind of brushing up against. It's always there, right? Like all through this, where is the line keeps being the question, but it's a question no one is specifically asking. It's there for us to ask. Nobody, with the exception of Sharon going, could you pump the fucking brakes and not cripple all of our suspects? You know, with the exception of that, no one's really asking the where is the line and are we over it question.
Well, I think Cap does challenge Karpov on that.
In the past.
There's the guy who kills his cousin. Yeah, in the past. So we have that in the past, but not in the present. And it's a really interesting question to ask because it's one of those subtextual questions. As you're watching the movies and the superhero stories and all of that, we are seeing superheroes do a fair bit of damage, not just to the villains, but often to the people who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that ends up because we are, fighting the good fight for the ultimate good. We use, human beings that are losing their lives in the story as, what they like to call collateral damage, which is a really difficult term, I think, because, like casualty is also a very difficult term because it fails to acknowledge the fact that these are innocent people who are just caught in the crossfire. But because that crossfire is taking down a really bad guy who would then go on murder and maim even more people, it does feel like we're asking that question, like, if it's a net good, then is that okay? Is this acceptable? Like, under what circumstances is this kind of, casual, loss of innocent life something that we just accept and don't talk about? So when you have a superhero comic that is actually interested in asking that question and examining those lines, all of this becomes so much more interesting. And I feel like, textually in these issues in this run, we are interested in asking that question.
No, I agree. And Captain America is, as a character, very uniquely placed, I think, to ask those questions. Because before he was a superhero, he was a soldier with just a really colorful uniform. When we talked about the first Avenger, the movie Captain America, the First Avenger, I was like, I don't love him running around with guns, and I like it better when it was him and Bucky, kid sidekick. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Than having the whole Howling Commandos, with him, because it made him a little too military. But at the same time, I have to recognize he's a super soldier. That was the point. And whatever he's doing in the present that feels more like a superhero thing, in the past, he was a man in a war and had to do, wartime stuff, which always trends towards the questionable. Like, let's just be honest, difficult decisions, air quotes, have to be made all the time. So.
Yeah, and it is in service of winning the war, and oftentimes in war, I mean, very rarely do we see, very clearly one bad side and one good side. There's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of storytelling going on, and the reality of the situation is probably a lot more muddy than that, with some glaring exceptions. I found this issue to be really interesting, really engaging, and I would give it an exposition pass on the parallel stories because I think we're okay there.
And that I was wanting to ask you a question as story expert. That is the seat in which you sit here, is that last issue. And I think this is actually pretty clever. We're going to get two exposition dumps, but we're going to get them in very different ways, right?
Yes.
And so usually you and I are not big fans of the flashback, but as mentioned, this one actually has its own internal narrative that parallels and reflects, if not directly interacts with the present, right?
Yes.
So asking you, and I think I already know the answer, which would you prefer? Would you prefer a lot of talking, or did you like a good flashback better as far as an exposition dump?
I mean, I think that if you have to get into very deep levels of exposition, which happens in situations like this where you have a lot of history, and also in stories where there is a lot of world building, like we need to understand how the world works, at least to a certain extent. So I think that this is your toolbox, right? If you have enough to go back, do a flashback, but tell a parallel story in that flashback that reflects on the current, I think that's your best bet. Generally, that's the best way to get the information across that you need to get, because you're still telling a story. And especially when that flashback story reflects upon the themes and ideas that are in the now,
right.
I think you're good to go. In this situation, we have Cap's flashbacks that are actually actively antagonizing him. Somebody has put these memories and altered them in his head. So his flashbacks, while also being, expository, are part of the now story, because that's something he's struggling with. So I think you get a pass on that. The only other kind of exposition that we have here is this talky exposition, like we were talking in the last episode about Sharon and Fury having that conversation about Jack Monroe and all of that history, right? That is probably the clunkiest method.
Yeah.
But you could study at the feet of Ed Brubaker how to do that efficiently. When you got to do it, how to do that super efficiently. I still can't believe that all that information got across in less than one page, because they were still doing other things on that page. It was pretty masterful.
Two separate pieces of exposition, because we had the one with Sharon and Nick, and we also had the one with Cap and the guy at the cemetery. And and you're still just like, I basically got it. I mean, debriefs are so easy for this, right? Like they're literally part of we expect them. They're part of the genre that we're going to get a debrief, which covers Nick and Sharon. But oh, by the way, here's Cap, who just decides to have a moment of connection with somebody at a cemetery because he is a man in need of a moment of connection at that point. Anyway, they're both really well done. But I think I prefer the flashback for a lot of the reasons that you bring up, like to kind of use like some poetry ideas, like the idea that the flashback can rhyme with the present. Like it doesn't have to directly reinforce, but that there is some of the same like stuff going on under the hood. I really like that. I think it's got more story juice, than just even knowing you're taking advantage of the debrief and the genre. It's still got more moxie with a flashback. So excellent. Yeah, but you're right. Just for both of them, here's Ed Brubaker. Learn something.
Okay, so now that I have mastered what is cover art and what is not cover art, on this issue, we have Cap flying out from what looks like a charred old European town. Of course, we're going to discover that it is exactly that, with two fiery dudes behind him. Although I guess Namor isn't fiery, it's just the Human Torch is kind of lighting everything in the light of his being on fireness.
And if there are two flaming guys, that's also Toro, the Human Torch's sidekick. We'll talk about him in a little while.
Oh, I am very excited to get some little background on that. But we've got the Nazi and Soviet flags flying behind them. And it's war poster iconic imagery, good guys fighting the good fight. But there is something, and especially as we see this happen, we find out what exactly that village is and what happened there. To see the charred, destroyed remains of a village, and that's what they're flying out of, I think really represents thematically exactly at what cost, I think is always the question that comes up with all of these heroic adventures. And so we're seeing this, heroism in the top part, and then we see the charred village at the bottom. And the first question is, at what cost?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you immediately kind of dial in on that war poster kind of propaganda feel. But then there is this kind of like sinister shadow self to it in this charred town, and that neither flag is in good shape. They're both in rough shape. And when we dig into the thing, we see compromises are made constantly by our supposedly heroic titular character. And there is absolutely a feeling where it's a Pyrrhic victory at best, which is kind of the Russian way. You come to find out, like that's very much a part of the or at least the pop cultural ethos of Russian culture. But I think if you study any kind of warfare in Russia, especially during World War II, like history bears that out too. They were just like, oh, are they coming? Just burn the crops and move 20 miles back. Oh, are they still coming? Burn the crops and move 20 miles back. Winter will be here soon to save us. What will we eat? That's tomorrow's problem. Today's problem is burn the crops and move 20 miles back. Like that, that was how they were going to win. And we see that. We literally see that here in the dead of winter with Cronus, with Cronus burning in the background. So, yeah. Big contrast right there on the cover.
Absolutely. All right. Now, interior art, again, we've been at this place. The flashbacks are wonderful. I love the aesthetic of the flashbacks. I love the beauty of the snow over the charred remains of the village is so heartbreaking. Did you pick out anything interesting in this week's interior art?
Well, the flashbacks are always done by a different artist. So this issue is much more flashback than present. So we get a lot more of Lark's work over Epting's, and they are not like wildly different, but they are different enough that it's, the contrast is definitely there. And I just enjoyed getting, whatever we got, about 18 or 20 pages of Lark instead of Epting, when it's been the other way around every other issue, I think.
Yeah, no, it was really highlighting that particular art style. And I thought that it was beautifully done, telling a story that was brutal and harsh. And there was something in that, in the way that it was so beautiful, combined with content that was so incredibly difficult. So again, we've talked a bit about the exposition of the story and how like it works in this case because we have it works really well in this case because we do have a flashback story that is entirely its own story. So I really, really loved that. But one of the things that I found kind of interesting in this thematically is the shadow side of our Captain America.
Yeah.
Captain America, when you think of Captain America, it's shiny, it's glossy, it's all about that victory. It's all about winning and he's out there just doing his thing. Here we are allowed to really talk about, again, like these things that become sort of subtext or extra textual, for us as readers, at what cost. And here we're seeing so much of the cost. We open up in the beginning of this flashback with one of the Russian soldiers immediately shooting a guy in the head, just killing him dead.
Yeah.
Right? And then they ask the question, and the soldier says, "That's my cousin." He went to the other side. That's my cousin. And Bucky is horrified at this, like absolutely horrified at this. We have Karpov torturing the one remaining living soldier for information, and Cap is disgusted, right? But we started this whole story with Cap going too far with the terrorists he encountered. So now we see him becoming the thing that he hates. And of course, we do have a bit of Bucky's darkness. We're going to talk about that in more detail later because that really deserves a highlight.
There's a lot going on there, absolutely.
Yeah. So what did you think about all of this shadow side stuff?
Well, I mean, I think I don't always think that kind of interrogation of the superhero concept is appropriate or useful or necessary or wise. I mean, not always. But as discussed, Captain America kind of can ride this in-between space where he's had to be a soldier and where compromises have to be made. And now in the present, he's a superhero and now he does not compromise, or compromises a lot less. Or when he does compromise, you have close friends like Sharon going, "You okay?" That's a contrast between Cap, the modern superhero, and Cap, the World War II super soldier. So yeah, like and as I've said about Brubaker and Epting before, like if you're going to make the cartoon characters for children carry all this kind of weight, these are the guys that can pull it off. They're doing it. And it is, it's really interesting to see that reflection in Karpov versus Red Skull, because we've already had some kind of opposite number with Red Skull as the symbol, and now we're seeing it like boots on the ground. And it's just, I'm going to tip my hand a little bit on one of my favorite story moments, but the fact that Cap has a narration where he says, this was normal for us, but I can't imagine what the Russians on the ground thought of people flying in the skies fighting. And then at the end, you have Karpov saying, you have your soldiers, you have your super soldiers and doomsday weapons, but all we have is our winter. And one of the ways that opposite number villains really appeal to me is that they're usually very much like the hero, but for one thing.
Fatal flaw.
I don't think that's Karpov. I don't think they're that parallel, but as far as their position in the war, him saying, well, yeah, you're doing all this like big technicolor, high adventure stuff. I'm here doing the actual fucking work because that's what Russia does. And in that respect, it's a subtle difference considering they're fighting the same war, that turns into a not so subtle difference at a character level. Anyway, I love it. Cap's shadow self in Karpov is good.
I think it's really nice. Okay, so here was the shocking moment for me. Okay, I'm reading this, and I have been working with you for some time, so I'm aware of the kid sidekick deal, right?
Yes.
Is that the kid sidekick was a character that was put in so that all the kids reading the comic books could feel and see themselves at Cap's side, hanging out with Batman, like all of those things, right? So the kid
a much easier self-insert character. I don't know if I can be Batman, but I could be Robin tomorrow.
I could be Robin. Exactly. So this is a younger character who is in this circumstance. And we have Bucky at the beginning, right? The soldier shoots his cousin in the head, dead, boom. And Bucky is like, wait a minute, dude, right? Moments later, Bucky is suddenly a shadow assassin. He is quietly going in and brutally taking out the guys at the watch, right?
Right.
So that they can attack in this town. And as I'm reading this, I was like, wait a what? We're having Bucky do this. And the thing is that this is a choice. You could have always brought in another, person, an unnamed assassin that we have Bucky standing behind Cap, and they're watching this happen. But watching it happen is different from doing it and being really good at it, which means this is not Bucky's first rodeo.
No.
So here we have this kid who is going in and super murdering these dudes. And I get it. Here's the thing. War is difficult and horrible, and there are choices that have to be made and things that people have to do that they would never, ever want to do. And I get all of that. But the thing is that when we're writing, when you're writing something, there's still somebody making this deliberate choice for a reason. And so I just want to hear your perspective on a character who started out as this kid sidekick, becoming something that has that much darkness. First of all, is this the first time we've known Bucky, in the stories, to be an assassin? Is this new information for somebody who's been reading these all along?
Yeah. Yes. This is now, okay. The slow darkening / growing up / just the more adult take on superhero stuff has been going on more or less since the mid 60s, more or less since Marvel showed up and turned kid stories into young adult stories.
Right.
And then we all just kept getting older, and the people that read comics became the pros in comics. And there was a whole these are literature, damn it, kind of thing. You get your Watchmen, your Dark Knight Returns, that kind of thing. So the slow darkening and adultening of superheroes is definitely a thing that's been going on. So I don't want to say this is the first time that we've ever seen Bucky be really competent with a machine gun and some grenades and stuff. But I do believe that the idea of him being the shady, shadowy, murdering front guard, the vanguard for Captain America, doing the stuff that Cap can't be seen to do, that I believe is 100% new and a retcon for this issue. And in retrospect, it's not that shocking. Let me rephrase. It is a shocking retcon, but when you get to know what this story is doing, it's less surprising. We've talked about how the reveal of Bucky as the Winter Soldier is not something we can dance around at this point because this was 2005 and there's been a movie, but it could not have been more shocking at the time. And so part of this is laying the track for Bucky as the Winter Soldier, that all the skills he would have needed to be the Winter Soldier were already kind of there, which is not a thing we would have been expecting from 13-year-old Bucky, G-Cap, let's punch some Nazis, which is very much what we were before this. So we're doing a much more grim horrors of war story and how that reflects into kind of a Cold War style, take in the present. And G. Willikers' Bucky is not going to fit at all, let alone as the eventual Winter Soldier. So in that respect, it's a good retcon, I think. Like, it's necessary for the story we're going to tell. At the same time, there's always a part of my brain that's like, for God's sakes, just let the fucking cartoon characters for children stay cartoon characters for children. I am of two minds.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So how old is Bucky exactly? Because originally it was Cap, and then Bucky was the was the kid's sidekick. So now Cap is, in the war. Cap is in his 20s, right?
Yeah. The feeling that I get is that Steve was old enough to enlist, but was too sick to enlist. So he's at least 18,
Right.
And he spent a year, let's say, lying about his identity to try and get in the war. That's a little pulled from the movie, but still. So 1920 by the time he's Captain America. So if he's been doing this for a couple of years, early 20s.
So how old is Bucky?
If you go back to the old stuff, he's a teenager. Like, he's a teenager. Okay. He grew up in army bases because his dad was a high-ranking military guy, and they moved around a lot. And so he always was surrounded by soldiers. And I believe, if I remember correctly, his dad died, and he was just sort of unofficially adopted by the last post that his dad was stationed at, which, what the actual fuck, but okay. Like, we're just trying to position a teenager where they can find out Captain America's identity and become his sidekick. Because that's how he became his sidekick, was like, oh, Private Steve Rogers is actually Captain America. Guess you got to take me on your missions with you. That's it.
So a little bit of blackmail between friends.
Yeah, sure. What is it? It's fine. So if you go back to the thing, he's like 13, 14, maybe 15 years old. Brubaker is aging him up. In the last issue, you actually had Cap say something like, well, that was ridiculous because that guy was like 17 and Bucky was nearly 20 by the time by the time he died. He's nearly 20. So there's definitely an aging up of Bucky to make it less awful and egregious.
Yeah, but even so, that's still at 19... Like, that's, 19 is technically adult, but as someone who has raised children who have been 19, this
is where little World War II stuff comes into. I agree, but let's remember, this is World War II, where we were enlisting anybody who could fog a mirror and was 18 or could reasonably lie about being 18.
Right.
You had tons of 16 and 15-year-old kids lying about their age or using their older brother's name or something to get to go, even when they were not old enough. And even when they were old enough, that's 18.
Yeah.
Enjoy the horrors of war. Yeah.
It's really, really stark, and I thought that was a very interesting choice. And it's kind of like, I'm glad that the shock that I felt as somebody who is not as familiar with these stories is also shared by people who are familiar with these stories, and maybe even a greater shock for people who are familiar, because they were expecting something entirely different from this. And I think that is it's an incredibly bold choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
To do something like that. And it does talk about, it brings in this, what war does, regardless of who is right and who is wrong. It is a devastating, horrifying experience that these young kids are going through. And Steve, even at, 21, 22, that's still a lot. It ages you very, very quickly.
Right.
I will say that, like, when you have experiences like that when you're young, you grow up a lot faster. So 18 in one person is not 18 in another person. It depends on what the experiences are that you've had.
Absolutely.
But damn. All right. So we go into this battle and we have these dudes who come by and talk to Cap. And I was like, at first I was like, why is this dude just walking around in his underwear in the middle of a Russian winter? Like, what is going on with that? And then I realized, of course, that he was the Human Torch. And as a woman in menopause, I have to say, like, I get it and I sympathize. He's not. The one who was just wearing his underwear is not the Human Torch.
He is not. Although I vibe with you on the fact that
Why did I get confused? Where did I come up with the Human Torch?
Well, because Toro has been shivering the whole time in the winter.
Oh.
The Human Torch who is not a human being at all, is wearing a coat. But the guy who's walking around in his underwear is Neymar the Submariner, Prince of Atlantis.
I'm so confused. Okay, yeah, because this was all stuff that was just kind of put on the page and it wasn't like deeply explained.
Yes.
Or even I seriously identified who was who in this circumstance. So I was running on assumptions here and I was completely wrong. Okay, so the Torch, who can light himself on fire.
Yes.
And keep himself warm seemingly in any circumstance, is shivering and freezing. And Neymar, who lives in water, is fine. Is it because snow is water? Like, what is going on?
Okay, got a couple of things.
Why is he wearing why is he naked, pretty much?
Oh, goodness. So many things to respond to. Okay, so the Human Torch.
So many questions.
Let me do the Human Torch first, because then Toro and then Submariner, because I feel like that will make the most sense. So the Torch is wearing a jacket, like he has a coat on, but they also specifically say that Toro, his sidekick, is the one who was shivering. And that's because the Human Torch is not a human being. He's an android. Why do they call him the Human Torch? Because the name sounds cool. That's it. Like there's... Yeah. Now, you have had a brush with this fellow before when we talked about Captain America, the First Avenger, because they go to the Stark Expo and there is a big glass case with kind of an android dude disassembled in it that says Dr. Phineas T. Horton's Artificial Man. Phineas Horton is the inventor of the android that would become known as the Human Torch. And by a sort of defect, he is able to burst into flame. And at first he can't control it. He's very much one of those old Marvel monster stories where you get powers, but it's actually bad for you, you know, and but over time he gets control of it. He fights the Submariner over New York City, a fire versus water kind of thing. He finds himself a kid sidekick who is not a robot, who is an actual human being that bursts into flame because he is a mutant. Like a Marvel mutant, right? His parents were
X-Men
nuclear physicists.
Kind of thing.
Right.
Sure.
Well, before there are X-Men, but yes, the mutants.
Okay.
So that's the Human Torch, who is not shivering because he's a fucking robot. But his kid sidekick, who is a mutant human, that's a little bit of an oxymoron, but you're with me on this, not a robot, is shivering because he, A, likes to be burst into flame, and B, is just a person in Russian winter. People who aren't Russian shiver, for God's sake.
Why? Okay, but the person who is naked is Neymar the Submariner.
Let's talk about Neymar the Submariner, also known as the Prince of Atlantis, also
not naked. He's wearing underwear.
But he has the Speedo on, right? Yeah. Okay, so Neymar is a half human, half Atlantean hybrid mutant. Okay. So he is a Prince of Atlantis, but most Atlanteans in the Marvel universe are blue-skinned, more like, you know, you would expect from a fish or an undersea dwelling person. He is obviously Caucasian looking after his father. Right. But in addition to that, he can breathe air, which most Atlanteans can't. He can breathe air and water. So that's part of his hybrid mutation. He also has wings on his ankles that let him fly. Don't think about it too hard. It's just a thing that happens. And he is able to swim at superhuman speeds, even compared to other Atlanteans. And the big one is he is crazy pants strong. He is like Hulk strong. As long as he's in water. He gets weaker the longer he's away from moisture, but still just one of the legitimately physically most powerful beings in the Marvel universe. Just when it comes to punching, that guy can really punch. He's always kind of been in this swimsuit Speedo thing and not much else because he is naturally physically tough. Like, he doesn't need armor. He's kind of indestructible. Now, why is he not cold in the Russian winter? Do you know how cold it is? At extreme depths in the ocean, colder than a Russian winter. So he just doesn't. So
he's just used to it.
He's adapted to living at the deepest depths of the ocean, which is part of why he's so physically tough also, right? Like he's withstanding those pressures. Right. But he's just not cold in Russia because it's not as cold as, I don't know, the Marianas Trench. Now, why is it always a Speedo? Because Neymar... Nobody loves Neymar as much as Neymar loves Neymar. And he is just like, yes, I am in fact the most impressive physical specimen in the world. Check me out.
All right. Okay. All right. That is all valuable information. I'm very, very much enjoyed that. And thank you very much for that, kind of refresher into 4-color facts, which I asked for in the script. And I was like, we need some 4-color facts on these guys because I don't even know what to say. So now I know who everybody is. That's great. That helps out a lot.
Last thing you need is that these were all characters that existed before Marvel was Marvel, right? Like these are during the 40s when they're still Timely and Atlas comics, okay? Mm-hmm. In the 60s, when Marvel kind of started to make a comeback, I mentioned to you that most of Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos, most of those stories, they're wartime stories, but they're written in the 60s, like looking back.
Right.
You got some of that with these characters also. They kind of retconned them into being a team. They all existed separately and were fighting Nazis at different ways and different times. They got retconned into a team called the Invaders. So Namor, the Torch, Toro, Captain America, and Bucky, the 5 of them together are the Invaders and operated in largely the Western Front as a unit.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why they're there. They knew it was going to be Hydra shit. So Cap was like, I need the rest of the Invaders. Let's go.
All right. And that gives us our, superhero team, guys flying through the air, which is at such contrast with Karpov and the tools that he has available to him. So here we have, our villains everywhere, right? Karpov is introduced and fleshed out in this backstory. He's really nicely constructed, having the other Russian soldier put his cousin in the ground in the opening of the flashbacks sets the stage for this being a grim story. It's not like the guy was a defector and I shot him in the head. It's my cousin. What?
It's a callback too.
Yeah.
Remember how we were introduced to Lucan?
Oh, right.
We were introduced to Lucan putting a bullet in the skull of the current Red Guardian and then insisting that he be buried with full honors because this is still our brother. This is still our Russian brother.
Yeah.
He's wrong-headed. We have to kill him, but we don't have to treat him poorly.
Oh, I love that. That adds more depth to that. Very, very good. And of course, down in this town, Red Skull is of course behind everything. He has his doomsday weapon. He's, throwing everything and then makes the big distraction so that he can get away. And then we have, in all of this, Karpov finding young Alexander Lukin.
Yes.
Right? Crying over his mother's dead body. And Karpov is all, get over it, kid. You're Russian. This is just how it is. That is a point, that kid is going to grow up way fast. He's maybe, I don't know, 8, 10, I think, in this. It's just, and it's such an interesting, contrast with Bucky, or maybe a repetition of Bucky, right?
That's interesting.
Is that here we're seeing how a kid like Bucky that can just super murder all these people and yet still get horrified when this guy kills his cousin,
Mm-hmm.
He can do all of that because he saw too much too young. And was involved in too much too young. And here is this kid, who is, was just living in a village. And then all of a sudden, explosions everywhere, everything on fire, people flying through the air, a man with a red skull and a doomsday weapon. His mother is dead. That is a lot. So getting that background on Lucan and bringing Lucan into, giving him that context in the present day for everything that's going on. It is a lot.
Yes.
It is intense. And it brings us down to if you use for the greater good, can't you justify pretty much anything?
Yes.
Isn't that what Karpov did? Isn't that what Lucan is doing? And that question, I think, is at the heart of what this story is about. Where do you draw the line when you're looking at quote unquote for the greater good?
It's a really interesting question. And I would like to draw really stark lines between World War II Cap and modern Cap, except we can't. Those lines were literally blurred in the first couple of issues before we knew we needed them. So well done again, Brubaker, you bastard.
Yeah.
You just twist us up before we even know we're getting twisted up. But I think that's a really useful and interesting question. And I think also having a character that is literally long-lived, like Captain America, allows us to take a look at some of these questions in terms of like generational trauma, generational evil. Like Lucan has essentially declared war on Steve Rogers in the present over something that happened when he was 8 years old, that Lucan happened to Lucan when he was 8 years old on behalf of his mentor as much as on behalf of himself. And it's like, I mean, it is personal, but also really not. Like, you're clearly, you know, late middle age, like you have all of this time between when that tragedy happened. You're actually more angry at Steve on behalf of your mentor than yourself, even though it was your village. Like, it's really complicated. Like, where is the line? And I think that the Karpov and Lucan answer is there isn't one. Like, and especially in Lucan's case, like, I feel like he had a line per se that Mother Russia was the greater good, right? Whatever I have to do for Mother Russia is the greater good. But when the USSR fell, and then he's just at loose ends, and he's like, I guess I'm the greater good, you know? And you have like young Captain America standing there while someone is tortured. I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't like it. Very topical for 2005, by the way, when we were in the thick of 24, the television show, and really having to have a lot of conversations about Gitmo and our pop cultural response to that and all that. Yeah, can you justify anything? Yes, obviously. You can justify anything, and it should be terrifying. I think the underlying there's a subtext here where the answer is yes, you can justify anything for the greater good, and that should be absolutely terrifying. And I don't think America or Americans treat it like it is as often as they should.
Well, I think America does the same thing.
That's what, yes, exactly.
You know, I mean, we subscribe to that. It's the greater good, and what will you do, you know, in service of the quote unquote greater good that you've also decided. But one of the things that I find just absolutely beautifully resonant here is that this, you know, whole run has been, you know, really focused on Cap's unprocessed trauma.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And what it's doing to him. And then if you have a kid like Lucan, exactly what opportunity is this kid going to have in that environment to process any trauma? Like, that shit's not going to happen. And unprocessed trauma leads to this kind of stuff, you know, where it's just you are feeling that experience over and over and over again, and you serve something that has meaning to you. And if you know, and it's like basically, you know, a way to create a situation where for the greater good justifies anything, and anything that you do is okay, because it serves, you know, vengeance. It serves a sense of justice. The things that were terrible that happened to you need to be avenged. I mean, for God's sakes, they're the Avengers, for fuck's sake. Right? That is unprocessed trauma in a box, in a label. It is about avenging the trauma, you know? I find it, once you start pulling at these threads, that sweater just comes apart piece by piece, thread by thread, you know? And I feel like that's deliberately done here, that we are, this is really what this is about, is talking about this, like what trauma does, how we respond to it, what we will do, you know, after having experienced it, if we're not willing to process it, you know, and it is very difficult to process it, especially for men. If you're looking at this time era in which, you know, men don't cry, men don't feel, don't talk about your feelings, like that is basically a petri dish for, you know, for a lot of really, really dark shit. So yeah, the whole thing, I think, is fascinating. In every issue we read, my respect for Brubaker like climbs exponentially. Because I'm seeing what's being done here and how deliberate it is, and how it's talking about things, you know, in its subtext, that are very deeply resonant in every single story they tell.
Yes. And All of that is true. Like they're doing some masterful work here with these kinds of questions that if you tug too hard on could unravel all of superhero stories. Like that's one reason that I think they work better for kids most of the time as metaphor, as fairy tale, action fairy tale kind of thing.
Yeah.
But when you get somebody who really knows what they're doing and who is really doing it, you get amazing stuff out of it. If there's been a place where that is dangerous to superhero stories as a whole, it's that you have a handful of people who do that really well. And then you get a bunch of yahoos who are like, yeah, that's easy. I'll just keep doing it. And then it's like, no, you guys are actually bad at this. And you're unraveling the thing. They were asking questions. They were, Alan Moore's Watchmen and Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns were huge for this in the mid 80s. And then you got a bunch of copycats who only kind of understood what they were doing. And it just becomes grim and gritty and gross.
And it's just grim for grim's sake. Right? Yeah. And that's not doing
value.
What they're doing.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, and I can see that being very frustrating for somebody who is such a fan of the genre.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the other thing is that like when I rail against this kind of thing, people are like, but what about Miller? What about Brubaker? What about Moore? And I'm like, yeah, that's 3. For every one of those, I've got 24 guys that hacked it out. And when you have 24 guys hacking it out and only a few virtuosos doing it well, which one of those takes do you think is going to stick? Right. So that's kind of the dualistic headspace I live in there, because clearly this is awesome and is asking good questions that it may or may not answer, but it's asking them in a way that makes us ask them, which is the real point.
Yes.
That's the art
which
point.
Is absolutely the point.
Yeah.
God, this is such a good read. I'm so excited about finishing this up. And you know what is awesome that I've just realized is that we're stopping at issue 6, but I bought the whole book. So from there, I don't have to wait week to week. I can just read the whole thing.
I'm really, I will be interested to see what you do there, because I plan on coming back to this on In the Gutters. Like we don't want to turn this into a Captain America show. But I do want to show you that when the best stuff is happening in superhero comics, it's usually over a run, right? That can be years long in the right hands, right? Okay. So I do want to come back to this eventually. And I was curious what you were going to do, because this story comes to something of a somewhere between a conclusion and an escalation in issue 6. And then we're going to do the Jack Monroe reprise, because it feels better here than at the beginning of our next stuff. When we come back, I want us to go right into it. But I was really curious what you were going to do. Were you going to keep reading? Would we have a conversation?
It's really hard for me to, like, honestly, every week it is difficult for me to stop reading, but because I know that I will confuse what was in one issue and what was in the next, I don't want to blur those lines so that I can, not talk about something that's coming in the next issue or in later issues and, leave myself unspoiled for this experience. But I don't know that I can wait to read the rest of this until the next time. But the thing is, by the time you bring it back, I will have forgotten anyway. Like, I will have read a million things between now and then. So I will have forgotten most of it, and I think I can do it again. But yeah, it's so interesting and fun and crunchy, and I really want to see how this whole thing turns out and what Brubaker does with it, which I absolutely love. So on that note, I'm going to go into favorite art, from this week. My favorite page in this whole thing, and there's a lot of good stuff, but I think that it's the panel where Karpov tells Cap that Russia has nothing but their winter, and he walks away as Cap watches him while the snow falls so beautifully over the remains of this village. It is so devastating. It is such a punch in the gut moment, and it is so incredibly powerful. I love that. It's one of my favorite panels of a comic ever, as I'm going through and starting to read more comics and starting to really pull out what my favorite stuff is. I think that may be one of my favorite moments.
I can't do anything. And I mean, there's a lot of fun stuff in this issue, but I'm with you. All I can do is say same as far as that panel goes. For me, it trips some of the same triggers as really good noir fiction in that like, I don't like true crime, but I love noir. And I think the difference there for me is true crime is real and has no poetry. Like, I mean, you know, written crime, noir crime, or in this case, war stories or espionage stories get to have that ring of poetry to them, where we are saying something really accurate, really true, that isn't factual. And I think that happens real big right there with Karpov walking away from Cap. In the snow, the winter just hiding them. Just separating them entirely.
It's so beautiful. The way that snow is drawn. That snow is drawn the way that you see it in, you know, like ads for Christmas and for like the representation of the beauty of winter. You know, the snow itself is beautiful, and it is falling, and it is going to cover the charred remains of this village. It's such a powerful moment. Honestly, one of the most powerful moments I think I've seen in comics, and I absolutely loved it. So going forward, what's your favorite part of the story?
I tipped my hand a little bit earlier. I really enjoy the part where Cap muses about how this fight is like Tuesday, you know, for him and the invaders, but that it just must be wild for those Russian troops. And the reason I really like that is there have been a few stories that really take a very boots on the street, like street level view of superheroes, so that we're following around somebody who's reporting on them or just happens to be there all the time when superhero stuff is going on. And I don't always love wallowing in that man in the street stuff, but every now and then it is really, at least for me, a powerful shock to be reminded that everybody in the Marvel universe does not ride on the shoulders of the superheroes like we do as the readers. Like imagining what it's like to be a person who just lives in Marvel New York. I don't think that's interesting enough to carry a story 9 times out of 10, but it is a really interesting backdrop for me to have, like, in my mind, to be reminded of that.
Perspective shift.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Is really great. Really great. What about you, Lonnie? What's your favorite part of the story?
My favorite part of the story is also the favorite piece of art. It is that moment when Karpov says, all we have in Russia is our winter. And that winter was used as the weapon, you know, that the Russians could withstand it, but other people not used to it couldn't. So the invading troops, if we just wait for winter, winter is our superhero, right? You know?
Yeah.
And the bleakness of that, when Karpov is walking away and he's like, you know, and you can feel that sense of like, you know, we've judged him, you know, we've judged this man based on what he's doing and how he's doing it. But when that's all you have, you know, when you are fighting for your life, you know, just trying to get through to the next day, it gives us this, it's incredibly humanizing moment for that character. And I still think that those questions are very important. You know, the like justifying for the greater good is a real problem. And it can go to very bad places, and I think often does. But somebody who's gone there, you know, like Karpov, has been through some shit, like has seen some stuff, and is basically, you know, a lot of these people are people that, given the choice, given the luxury that I have, because I don't have to make those choices, so I can just sit here and talk about how difficult they are. Somebody who's actually made those choices, when you see the cost of those choices on their humanity, I mean, God, that it's just so freaking brutal. And that combined with discovering this 8-year-old kid, suck it up, kid, your mom's dead, let's move on. It is, it's just so beautifully done. And I really can't wait to see where we go with it next week.
We'll be back next week with Captain America Winter Soldier issue number 6, in which Captain America confronts his greatest failure. He also saves Agent 13, but in the process, the Cosmic Cube is empowered by Lucan. Cap has won a battle, but the war doesn't look good.
Thanks for listening to In the Gutter with Joshua Unruh and Lonnie Diane Rich. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider talking about it with your friends, leaving a review somewhere, or supporting Chipperish Media, patreon.com/Chipperish.